Hey everyone, and welcome to another devlog video for the NPC Manager system. The past few days I've been looking at adding optimization options to the system. I actually watched a GDC talk on YouTube from the guys that made Assassin's Creed Unity, and they were talking about how they managed to create such huge crowds in the game. If you've ever played the game, you'll know that if you're walking around in Paris, there are literally hundreds and hundreds of NPCs all around, massive crowds. And they were talking about different methods that they use to make sure that you could run that in a performant way. So I figured that maybe I could look into ways of doing something similar. So obviously, I'm not shooting to compete with what Ubisoft can do. I'm just a single guy, right? But I figured, hey, let me see how much optimization I can get to get as many NPCs in a scene as possible. So you guys, if you eventually get the system, you can have crowds in your own games. So as you can see here, in this level, this is called crowd test. I have a bunch of NPCs. As you can see, I'm going to zoom out here. Look at all those NPCs here. As a matter of fact, I have, I believe, over 500. Let me see, how many do I actually have? Yep, 504 NPCs in this entire scene. Let's see as a baseline what this looks like performance-wise if I don't use any optimization except the optimizations that are available in the engine. So if you go to, and this is basically regular options. If you go to any skeletal mesh, there's going to be a bunch of options that are talking about optimization. You can see it right here. If you didn't know this, you should definitely use this in your game. This is nothing I did, but you can definitely enable certain options like update rate optimization, only tick when rendered, etc. That is going to make a big difference when you have a lot of NPCs. That's basically limiting the rate at which it updates the animation, updates the bones, collisions, etc. So that already is a good start. But if I click play here, you can see that even though I'm really far, meaning that a lot of these are probably ticking very slowly, I'm still getting about 60 frames per second, right? So let me just maximize here. I'm actually, if I maximize, yeah, I'm still getting about 60 frames per second. This is 500 active NPCs. They're not really doing much. They're just walking around. And you can see that if they get close, they can do this little interaction. That was already there before, but maybe you didn't see it on the video. These are completely random. There is a small chance, a percent chance, that if two NPCs are walking around roaming and they get close to each other, they can do this spontaneous conversation. So you can see these guys are talking here and those guys are talking here. You can configure the percent chance and the length of the conversation and the I guess the trigger size as to how often these guys can interact. So that's pretty cool, but still you can see that we're getting, actually right now, even below 60 frames per second, we're getting about 45 to 50. So huge cost. I mean, this is just an empty scene with a bunch of NPCs. So right now you're going from 120 frames to less than 60 frames, maybe 55, 50. So extremely expensive. Obviously, you will never want to have so many active, full-blown NPCs in your world. So you have to do something about that, right? So the very first thing I did is I've added a proximity system very similar to what I have with ABK. If you own the Animal Behavior Kit or if you've seen the videos, I have the Activation Manager, which basically says that you're going to trace around the player, the active player, and all of the NPCs in a certain radius are going to be active and everybody else is going to be inactive. So right now, if I go to my NPC controller here, I've added a bunch of optimization settings here. And spoiler alert, you can see that I have actually three different things. I have a proximity system, visibility optimization, and rendering. So let's just go ahead and just tick proximity. Come on. And let's gonna go ahead and compile. And the proximity system uses, again, location based on the player. And to activate it, not only do I have to enable it on all the NPCs, and that's because Maybe certain NPCs, you don't want them to be affected. Maybe like hero NPCs that should always be active for whatever reason, that you can just go to the specific NPC, right, and disable it on that NPC specifically, right? As you can see here, I'm just changing the default so they're all affected. But I go to the NPC Manager, and right here I have the option to use the proximity system. So I'm going to select use proximity system, and I'm going to debug the trace, and I'm going to show you the stats. And I'm going to do a sphere trace every 2 seconds with a radius of 8,000 units. That's pretty big, right? We definitely want to see the NPCs really far away. So remember, without anything else, we were getting about 50 frames per second on average. Now let's click play here. And now you'll see, obviously, because I'm going to leave out here, you can see the trace here. Because we're completely outside of the area where all the NPCs are, you can see on the stats on the left, 0 active NPCs and 504 inactive NPCs. Obviously, I'm getting, the full 120 frames per second. So as I'm getting closer and closer and closer, you can see that now 18 NPCs are active. You can see on the top left, 26 are active, 36. So as I'm moving around, more and more NPCs are becoming active. And as I move around, you can see that the NPCs are kind of talking here, 75. And let me disable the trace, because that actually affects performance, believe it or not, when you have all these different traces that you have to mark. So let's do it again without the trace, and you'll see that kind of a real performance numbers here. We got about 22 active. Now we have about 61 active, and we are 70, 65 sometimes, 78, 85 active. So it's still not amazing, but it's definitely better, right? So we're right now at least 20 frames per second more than before, and we have about 107 active NPCs. But you can see all the way in the back, there's no NPC. So as I move around here, then more and more NPCs are being activated, and then the ones in the background are going to be deactivated. There you go. So it really depends on your setup. If you have a big city or a town, if you're playing, if you're making an RPG and you have really tight buildings, you don't need such far view distance. You can make that radius smaller, which of course will mean a smaller number of active NPCs at all times, which means better performance. So obviously you have to play with how you're configuring your game. But even at 8,000, which is a pretty big distance, you can see that we're on average getting about 70 with about 100 active NPCs. So that's one system, but it wasn't enough because the problem that I saw was, well, I am activating NPCs around the player, but a lot of these NPCs may not be visible to the player. If an NPC is here, right, and you're here, you're not really looking at the NPC. So why am I incurring the cost of that NPC that's not physically visible by the player? These guys here that are not visible should be disabled as well, right? So you can overlay the systems. First, only allow a certain amount of NPCs around the player to be active, and even while they're active inside that radius, a lot of them could be called because of visibility, right? So I have another system which is using the rendering system, which basically is a node called has been recently rendered, I think it's called. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show render stats here, and I'm going to activate use rendering optimizations. So this is basically looking at what is visible through the player's camera, and anything that's outside of what is called the view frustum of the camera is automatically going to be disabled, even if it's within the radius of the player. So if I do that and I activate both, you'll see that now I'm gonna walk a little bit more here. You can see on the top left we have two different settings here. We have 46 rendered NPCs, 33 rendered NPCs, but 84 active, which means that even though 83 or 82 are active, only 25 are being rendered, which means that we can be more performant. If I look up, for example, notice now that my NPCs rendered goes to 0 because no NPC is on the camera's direction, even though 99 are active. So even though 99 NPCs are active, my frame rate is now almost 120 because all of them have been disabled, right? And then I look around and I can see that, right? So all of the NPCs that are behind me that are not facing the camera are going to be disabled. So look here, I'm getting almost 120 frames per second because on the top left, you can see here 0 NPCs are rendered, even though there's 64 NPCs that are active, and I'm getting a lot of performance there. So yeah, so this combination works well. However, there is a problem, and that is that this method does not include culling. It only looks at the view frustum of the camera, but it doesn't take occlusion culling into account. So what do I mean by that? Is the camera has like this angle here, and all of the NPCs that can be visible are going to be active. But right here you see that a lot of these NPCs that a lot of these NPCs should not be active because they're being called. So let me show you guys what I mean by that. If I'm standing right here, only 7 or 8 are being rendered. If I stand right here, 0 are being rendered. And I have something else that I've added, which now if I eject and I go and look at the NPCs, look what's happening here. I'm actually disabling a bunch of components, including the animations and including the skeletal mesh, and I'm removing tick from all those actors. You can see that they're basically still moving around, but they're now in a partially disabled state, which is kind of cool. So that is the reason why you're getting such performance. And the last thing, which is kind of related to that, is the visibility optimization, which basically does a trace between the player's camera and each nearby NPC. And what that does is the same thing. Even if you have a really crowded area of NPCs, anything that the player camera cannot see will automatically be disabled. And I find that this, ironically enough, I'm actually doing traces, is actually cheaper sometimes than rendering. Apparently, to see if an actor has been rendered recently, it's actually quite expensive operation. So I found that one of the better combinations is actually to simply say, use visibility optimization, but don't use rendering optimization. And then the player itself has a little component. And this component, I'm going to activate it here. Can use the proximity system. I'm going to use the proximity system, that's more efficient. And looks at whether, let me see, I don't want to trace anything. Yep. Looks at nearby NPCs and decides whether the NPCs are, let me remove the render stats, whether the NPCs should be active or not. So these are all of the active NPCs here. But look what happens now. As soon as they are no longer visible by the player's camera, look at this guy here. As soon as he leaves the visibility area, like all these guys, they're just skating around. I'm disabling tick, and I'm disabling animations, and I'm disabling the skeletal mesh. So you can see these guys are skating around. Like this guy, you see how he immediately stopped, and these guys are about to enter the visibility area and they start walking again. And there you go. So that combination means that you can still have NPCs moving around. They're not completely removed by the proximity system, but they're severely disabled because, whoops. Oh yeah, I'm flying around. That's something I have to fix. Apparently sometimes NPCs hit me and I go flying around. But you can see here that as soon as I land, a bunch of these NPCs appear. But now, even though I have over 100 NPCs, before using visibility, I was getting about 70 frames per second, and now I'm getting close to 80 frames per second. So using that visibility trick is giving us about 10 frames per second. So yeah, sorry, I don't know if this is confusing, but I'm basically using 3 different methods to try and squeeze as much performance as possible out of all these crowds. And again, I love the visibility trick. I really enjoy the skating NPCs. I was laughing a lot when I finally got it working, like this guy, and immediately starts walking. So normally in a game you would never notice. You could have crowds of NPCs moving around, and as soon as you turn the corner, those NPCs would immediately stop ticking and animating, but they're still going to be moving. So if they have schedules, if they have somewhere else to be, if they're in a market, if they're individual NPCs, right now they're indistinguishable, but if you can actually identify them and follow them, then you'll be able to do that seamlessly. So yeah, what do you guys think? I'm pretty happy where I am. I have one more optimization that I have not implemented yet, and that's really important. And that is, if I expand the options here, you'll see that I have a bunch of options similar to ABK, like make invisible, disable collision, tick, animation, blah, blah, blah. Pause routine is the one that I still have to implement, and I don't have that yet. And that basically means NPCs usually have a routine, right? They're going from point of interest to point of interest, or from station to station. Right now, if I disable them, they're still going to continue with their routines. I want to have an option to pause their routines, at least with the proximity system. So they're not completely removed, but the routines are just paused. And I think that's going to make it look way more natural, especially if you keep track of specific NPCs in your game. So yeah, that's all I have for you guys today. I'm pretty happy so far. It's taken me some experimenting, to say the least, but this is even more aggressive optimization than what I'm doing with ABK. And as a matter of fact, I will probably include the visibility stuff in the next ABK update. It's even easier to do with animals because animals don't have complex routines like these NPCs. The animals are just kind of roaming around. So having them stop ticking and stop animating and all that good stuff is actually even easier to do. So yeah, over 500 NPCs, guys, and getting close to 80 to 90 frames per second. I'm pretty happy about that. We went from about 45 to close to 90 with these systems. And obviously you have the option to use the systems in any combination, and obviously you can tweak exactly what gets disabled on every category, which is another cool thing. So based on your game, based on how populated the area is, based on how many occluders there are, right? You can easily tweak the settings on a per NPC basis to make sure that you get the most out of your NPC crowds. So yeah, what do you guys think? Any ideas of what else I could do to improve optimization? Do you like where this is going? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll talk to you guys in the next video.